If you were not from New York City during the 1990s, if I told you some of the stats, you would be shocked. Senseless violence, children hit by stray bullets, drug killings at the peak of the crack epidemic, and random robberies gone wrong. 2,245 homicides that year, a record unsurpassed except by the September 11 attacks. That came out to about 6 killings a day. One homicide, the case of Brian Watkins. You can see the family of Brian Watkins there. Was one of the most notorious cases in New York City in 1990, and it still kind of remains there as being one of the most notorious cases. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about that case, and I also want to tell you some developments that has happened since this case. That is a picture of Brian Watkins. Now, the members of the Watkins family, they were all avid tennis fans, and they came out east to see the U.S. Open, which coincidentally was a favorite pastime of Mayor David Dinkins, mayor at the time in New York City. They spent all day on Sunday, September 2nd, watching tennis, and after that, the members of the family returned to their hotel room on the Hilton, which was on West 53rd Street in New York City. Now, Brian's brother had a craving for Moroccan food that night, so the family had asked a hotel employee to recommend for a place for them to go. Now, he told them about a place in Greenwich Village, and he pointed them toward the subway station at 53rd and 7th Avenue. I will take you to there in this video. Now, meanwhile, as this was going on, a train was making its way from Queens, and it was loaded with about, let's say 40 to 50 teenagers. And they were headed towards the nightclub, the club Roseland, which was located on West 52nd. So club, a bunch of teenagers and a night of dancing, drinking. And that day, Roseland Ballroom had a Latin DJ playing, a famous Latin DJ playing in Roseland. Now, Roseland has since closed, but, New York City back then, it's a lot different in New York City now, but New York City back then had a lot of these nightclubs. It's known for its nightlife and nightclubs. Sound Factory, Webster Hall, Limelight, Tunnel, Roseland. So all these places were, in the city, and Friday, Saturday nights, filled with club hoppers. And I want to tie that in, tie in a name. Keep this name in the back of your head here. That name was Johnny. And he was an 18-year-old from Bayside who was about to enter his final year of high school. He was with several friends. He was on that train ride. Now, his mother had testified that he had cash, since she would pay him $150 every week to help her with a business that she had ran. So keep that in mind. So we see the Watkins family, they're going to take the train to get some Moroccan food. And there was a train that was coming into the station that they were going to. And a bunch of kids from Queens going to the club Roseland. Okay? Now, part of the group of these teenagers, they did not have the $15 cover charge to get into a club. And some of them, they hatched a plan. And that plan was to grab a wallet from someone, as the co-defendants put it. Now, after the train arrived at 7th Avenue, the whole group, and there was approximately 50 people, left the station and they headed toward the club. While the smaller group of people there that didn't have the money to get into the club, the cash, they lagged behind and went back into the station now. One jumped the turnstile and opened the exit gate, and the group had ran down to the subway platform. Now, at that moment that the group was sneaking back into the subway, Brian Watkins was buying tokens for his family. New Yorkers that live here, they would have probably thought better of following a group of mischievous teens down the stairs, in a period of 1990. But that's exactly what the Watkins family did. Now, they went down to the platform and they stood in a semicircle near the middle of the platform. So the mugging was fast and furious because of the way they were standing and the speed of the attack. Each family member saw what happened from a different perspective. Now, they all testified that they heard a loud commotion and suddenly they were set upon. Brian's father, Sherwin, was knocked to the ground and he was slashed with a box cutter. His front pocket was torn open and he sustained a deep wound near the top and back of his leg. Brian's mother said she was grabbed by the hair, hunched over, and kicked in the face and chest. Now, when Brian saw this, he lunged toward her and was stabbed in the chest by a teen named Yoel Gary Morales, who had confessed to the crime, but he claimed that Watkins lunged into his knife. At that point, someone had pulled a roll of bills, and it had contained about $200 from Mr. Watkins' torn pants. It was made mention in court that someone from the group said, "We got it," and the group ran back up the stairs. Now we come back to Brian here, and he says that while all of this was taking place, he was up on the sidewalk. He was talking to two girls and waiting for a friend to emerge from the subway. He claims that he had no knowledge of the plan to mug somebody and that he went down into the subway to look for a friend. Where was he? His name was Anthony, who Brian maintains was holding his money because he was wearing tight jeans with no hip pockets. So Brian said that he ran from the station when he heard that the group had attacked the Watkins running out. And they had apparently left for Roseland with the initial group. And that's where they were headed. Here's a kind of how a modern New York City subway looks like. So you get the idea, standing in a semicircle. Now, while as all of this has happened, the family is mugged, and Brian Watkins now, he's running after the group that mugged him. And he is unaware that his pulmonary artery was severed. He had collapsed on the first landing near the token booth of the subway system. In the subway. The first police officers to arrive at the scene carried Watkins up the stairs to the street, then placed in an ambulance driven to St. Vincent's Hospital. According to trial testimony, he died in the ambulance. His parents had sued the city for $100 million. They claimed that the long ride to a hospital, which was more than 40 blocks away in the city, and the unsafe subways they had contributed to Brian's death. After receiving assurances from Giuliani that they would be dealt with fairly, the family was forced to settle, unhappily, in 1998, so this took about 8 years, and they had settled for, guess this, $300,000. So while all this commotion is going on, two men who were drinking beer on the sidewalk near the subway entrance there, they were a locksmith and a shoe shiner that was their craft. They came forward several hours after the attack, and they told police that they had witnessed the group, that they had exited, re-entered, then ran out of the subway system. They claimed that they went down the stairs and they saw Watkins. The men said they got nervous and they left. Detectives later took the two men to the Roseland Ballroom, and they walked through the club, and they pointed out two suspects. Other detectives brought the extremely distraught Watkins family after what they just went through from the hospital to a street near the nightclub, where they were asked to view the suspects from inside a police car. All the patrons, they were forced to exit the club through one door. And between identifications made by the family and the two witnesses, the police had detained approximately 8 suspects for questioning, several of whom were released. Now, Brian, he was not detained and questioned in that initial group. Now, through the questioning of initial suspects, detectives got Brian's name from his best friend, who was part of the crew from Flushing and was picked up carrying an orange box cutter the day after the murder. Now, because of this, the detectives, they had decided to go to Brian's house at about 9 p.m. the following night. They walked in apparently without a warrant and started asking if Brian lived there and if he was at home. Now, Brian was home. He was watching, TV, and he had come down. And the detective said that they wanted to ask Brian a few questions. And he was taken to Midtown North and police to that police station there, and they had questioned him with a series of detectives. According to him, one detective cursed at him, shoved him, slapped him, and slammed his head into a desk, while another played the good cop. So now Brian says that, he was promised that if he had signed a confession admitting that he had played a minor role in the mugging, that they would drive him home in the morning and he'd be freed. Otherwise, that he would face a murder charge and that he would never see his family again. Brian was picked up by police at roughly 9:30, and about midnight, that same night, he had broken down and agreed to sign a confession. Only then was he read his Miranda rights, according to the testimony of the detectives who took his statement. After signing a confession that was written out by the detectives, he was videotaped, confirming the details. So the details of that confession, it was confirmed on videotape. Now, the detectives, they had gotten Brian to admit to 2 key things. First, that he took part in a robbery, and second, that he knew his friend had a weapon. His name was Fernandez. Although they told him apparently the exact opposite information. By securing those 2 elements in his confession, they were able to charge him with second-degree murder. New York and 45 other states have felony murder statutes that allow defendants who knowingly take part in a crime that results in a homicide to be charged with murder, whether they had any direct participation in the killing or not. So, Brian eventually was picked out in the lineup after the confession, and he had went to trial, and his trial lasted 7 weeks. And like most murder trials, it was filled with testimony, gut-wrenching testimony by the victims' relatives, technical testimony by doctors and other experts. The family of Brian, his parents, his brother and sister, they described in detail what they saw and what they had thought and felt as the mugging was unfolding in front of their eyes. The prosecution, as is customary, put them on the stand first. And just that horror of their experience overshadowed the whole trial. Now, the defense attorneys for Brian and his actual 3 other co-defendants, they were hamstrung during the family members' testimony. There were weaknesses and inconsistencies, but to kind of impugn the family members before the jury would clearly have drawn bias against the defendants. When asked after she recognized anyone in the courtroom as the persons who had attacked her and her family, Brian's mother, Karen, she had replied no. In doing research, and this is a photo of Brian years later, and I'll explain what I mean years later when he was back in court. So throughout the original trial, the article summarized that there was very little questioning of the veracity of the statements by the detectives. And on the rare occasions when the defense attorneys, when they challenged the detectives' testimony, they were overruled by the judge and they ordered to move their line of questioning along. Now, the jury came back with guilty verdicts for Brian and all 3 of his co-defendants in 5 hours. They were all convicted of second-degree murder and 2 counts each of robbery, first and second degree. Following his conviction, Brian's working-class parents paid a series of lawyers small fortunes to file appeals, none of which came through any fruition. One appeal that made it all the way to the federal appellate level addressed the exclusion of the videotape confession of Ricardo Lopez, who said that Brian had left before the robbery, but it was denied. In part, the appeals court said because Lopez's evidence would have not created reasonable doubt as to Brian's guilt. So all these years pass, and we fast forward to 2017. As we see, we were approaching the subway station where all of this happened, right on the very right-hand side, right there. So it is now the year 2017, and the prosecutors said that they had dropped the case against him, who he had spent a quarter of a century behind bars. The prosecution said that they were committed to retrying Brian, but they didn't believe they could win a conviction in the case. Because in 2015, after many appeals, that's when his conviction was overturned. But he still faced the possibility of a retrial, potential return to prison. And that's why the prosecution dropped everything in 2017 against Brian. So he spent a quarter of a century behind bars. This happened in 1990, remember? And he was let go. Remember, Brian said that he was put under pressure to make a confession and, in the hopes of going back home because he was already there for hours and he was defeated. So like watching some of those cop shows and that you see on TV. I do believe it at times. Times I do believe that something like that could happen. Very sad story. You could see there the former Roseland, which is where these kids were going to. Very sad situation. A young man lost his life trying to defend his family honor. They just wanted to go out to eat. These kids wanted to go to, a show that they didn't have money for. And they took a young man's life. For what? A $10, $15 admission. Very sad case. Very sad case. I hope we teach our children to do better and be better. Hope all is well.